What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in this video I'm going to be going through my Week 11 quarterback start sits, so breaking down all 14 Week 11 matchups, talking about every single starting quarterback, and then listing them as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. The starts are going to be the players you feel very confident starting, typically as like your mid to high end QB1s. This week, I kind of have a lot of starts. I talked about this in the tight end video. It feels like both the quarterback and tight end positions are very, very deep this week, potentially the deepest we've seen all season long, which is pretty impressive considering the fact that we do have players on bye. The quarterback position, I felt like heading into the season was pretty strong, a lot of depth. Early on in the season, it wasn't looking great. I think at this point, it has definitely bounced back. A lot of players you trust week to week. We maybe haven't had like the super high ceilings of like the 24 plus point per game guys that we've seen over the past couple of years, but a lot of very, very playable options. So those are going to be the starts. The fringe options, these are going to be like your very back end QB1s, your higher end QB2s. You may not love them as your QB1, but they're definitely serviceable, not going to, tank your lineup rest of season or this week. And then the sits, players that you would prefer to keep on your bench. We're going to dive right into the Thursday night matchup where we have the Bengals taking on the Ravens. Joe Burrow definitely looks like he's back. I'd expect him to probably not have T. Higgins for this one, but his weapons are still fine with Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd. He does draw a tough matchup, but when Joe Burrow is playing at the level he's been at, seems like he's fully healthy. I know they just lost to the Texans, but still a solid overall game from Burrow. I like him as a start here this week. To me, Joe Burrow is in that tier of quarterbacks where when he's healthy, he's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, and those are quarterbacks I'm going to play regardless of matchup. And kind of a similar thing here with Lamar Jackson. Fantasy-wise, he really hasn't been great over the last few weeks. I still think he's in that range where he has that upside with his legs. Not a brutal matchup against this Bengals defense. I also like Lamar as a start, even if he's not necessarily giving you like that high-end QB1 production that you were expecting when you drafted him. Shifting over to the Sunday games, we have the Cowboys taking on the Panthers. I mean, pretty clear start, pretty clear sit here. Dak Prescott has been on an absolute tear over the past few weeks. He has been a great fantasy option. You continue to roll with him as a very strong play. And then for the Panthers, tough matchup. Bryce Young obviously hasn't been a great fantasy option. Definitely going to be sitting Bryce Young. We're going to have a divisional matchup between the Steelers and the Browns. For the Steelers, Kenny Pickett, definitely going to be a locked-in sit. Hasn't been fantasy relevant and draws a tough matchup. For the Browns here, I think Deshaun Watson is like a fine fringe option, probably like a high-end QB2 this week. Hasn't necessarily had a crazy high ceiling, but in the games he's been healthy for, he's been a fine option if you have been starting him. Another divisional matchup between the Bears and the Lions. If we have Justin Fields for this one, I'm going to be starting him. Even coming off the injury, if they deem him, healthy enough to play, I'll feel confident with it. Justin Fields has that crazy high ceiling week to week, so he'd be a start for me. And then if it's Bajent, definitely going to be sitting Bajent. And then for the Lions here, Jared Goff's kind of been a fringe QB1 this season. I really like the matchup here against the Bears. I think he's playing some good football. With the matchup thrown in there, I think he's a nice start as like a mid to back end QB1 play. We're going to have the Chargers taking on the Packers. For the Chargers here, Herbert coming off a huge game against Jared Goff, the guy I just talked about. I think Herbert's a nice mid to high end QB1 play. Even with Mike Williams out, some injuries offensively, him and Keenan Allen are still keeping it rolling here. Matching up against the Packers, I like him this week. And then for the Packers here, Jordan Love hasn't been as great, at least fantasy-wise, as he was earlier on in the season, but he's still been fine over the past few weeks. I feel like Jordan Love is kind of like the definition of a fringe play. You would rather have a slightly better quarterback, but he'll be fine if he is slotting in as your QB1, assuming, you have a decent roster around him. Shifting over into the Cardinals Texans matchup, this is, I feel like, the tier of quarterbacks where it's really kind of bolstered the position as a whole. Guys like Kyler Murray and CJ Stroud, there wasn't a ton of confidence that these would be players you could trust week to week. For me, the concern with Kyler coming back from the ACL was I wasn't sure how mobile he'd be or like if they would let him use his legs. He used his legs very effectively in Week 10. He didn't throw for a touchdown and still gave you 17-plus points. Got in there with his legs. So I like Kyler moving forward. Not a super tough matchup here against this Texans defense. So I think Kyler's honestly a guy I'd feel pretty confident moving forward. As a player, I was probably higher on Kyler than most heading into the season. I think he gets a lot of unnecessary hate. People like to point to the video game stuff. I think he's a very, very solid NFL quarterback. He has that rushing upside for fantasy, so I do like him. And then for CJ Stroud, playing at a crazy high level, continues to impress week after week. Plus, he draws a nice matchup here against the Cardinals. I also think CJ Stroud is definitely a solid play in your lineup. The next matchup is going to be the Titans taking on the Jaguars. And for the Titans, we had Will Levis with the big debut game. The last 2 weeks, definitely not been great. Not saying he's going to be like a terrible quarterback moving forward. I just think with the depth of the quarterback position at this point, he would be a sit for me. I think there's going to be better options out there in a normal-sized league. For the Jaguars here, Trevor Lawrence has probably been one of the more disappointing fantasy quarterbacks this season. I feel like from a real-life NFL perspective, he's been pretty solid. But fantasy-wise, he was like the guy taken after that tier of Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert. I think a lot of people thought he'd be jumping into that tier. That has not happened, and it's really just come down to a lack of touchdown passes. The touchdowns just haven't been there for him, which have really been hurting his fantasy value. I still think he's a fringe option. Decent matchup here against the Titans, but definitely not a locked-in start at this point. Shifting over to the Raiders-Dolphins matchup here. Pretty clear sit and a pretty clear start for the Raiders. Definitely going to be sitting Aiden O'Connell. Even though they've won 2 in a row, in the offense definitely hasn't looked super electric. And then for the Dolphins, coming off the bye week, I like Tua as a solid start. He's been a mid-tier QB1 so far, so I think he keeps that going here against the Raiders. We're going to have a divisional matchup between the Giants and the Commanders. Danny DeVito, this dude's a locked-in sit. Giants offense looks pretty abysmal at this point, so definitely going to be a sit for Danny DeVito. And then for the Commanders, honestly, Sam Howell has been pretty impressive, both as a real-life NFL quarterback and a fantasy option. This Giants team, like I mentioned, is pretty much in shambles at this point. We just saw Dak Prescott go in there, absolutely dominate. So I do like Sam Howell as someone I'd be playing with some confidence this week. In the next game, we have the Buccaneers taking on the 49ers. Baker is someone who kind of week to week I think has been a decent streaming option. With this bye week not having a ton of super fantasy relevant quarterbacks, I don't think you're going to need to be forced to play a guy like Baker, especially in a really tough matchup here against this 49ers defense. They had been slipping for a couple weeks prior to the bye, but they went out, completely shut out the Jaguars. I would definitely prefer to be sitting Baker Mayfield this week. And then for the 49ers, the Buccaneers have been a really nice matchup for opposing fantasy quarterbacks. Brock Purdy coming off a solid game where he got all his weapons involved. I do like Purdy as a solid start here going up against the Buccaneers. A divisional matchup between the Jets and the Bills here. For the Jets, no surprise, definitely going to be sitting Zach Wilson. And then for the Bills, man, it seems like the Josh Allen hate cycle has kind of been thrown around here. Obviously, fantasy-wise, he hasn't been delivering you like that crazy production he has over the last 3 years, like the 23, 24 plus points per game, but I still believe he's the QB2 at this point. Continue to fire him up with a whole lot of confidence, even if it is a tough matchup here against the Jets. We're going to have the Seahawks taking on the Rams, and Geno Smith is coming off, I believe, his best game of the season fantasy-wise, if not like second best. I still don't think he's someone I want to be playing this week. He had the prime matchup going up against the Commanders. A little bit of a tougher matchup here against the Rams. And outside of that Commanders game, he really just hasn't been playing at a super high level. With the other depth at the quarterback position, I would prefer to be sitting Geno Smith. And then for the Rams, if Stafford is able to give it a go, I have him as a fringe option. Decent matchup against the Seahawks. He has the weapons with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. If they end up going with Carson Wentz, Stafford can't go, then I definitely would be sitting Carson Wentz in this one. Then looking at the Sunday night game, we have the Vikings taking on the Broncos. For the Vikings here, I currently have Josh Dobbs listed as a start. He's been a solid fantasy option in his 2 games with the Vikings. It's been very impressive. I think if Jefferson isn't able to give it a go, you could maybe argue him as a fringe option, but I'd still probably keep him as a start. If Jefferson is able to give it a go, he's a locked-in start, looking like a great option rest of season if those weapons can't stay healthy for him. And then for the Broncos, even if it doesn't look pretty, Russ has honestly been not that terrible of a fantasy option. He's been a solid mid-tier, like mid to high-end QB2, so I have him as a fringe option here. You'd prefer to have a better option, but I don't think you're in a terrible spot if you end up firing up Russ this week. And then the final game of the week, 2 of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, Super Bowl rematch here on Monday Night Football. Eagles taking on the Chiefs. You fire up Jalen Hurts. You fire up Patrick Mahomes with a lot of confidence with both of these guys. Jalen Hurts has been great. Patrick Mahomes, a little bit up and down, just lacking some of the weapons there, but this Eagles secondary really hasn't been great. Both of these teams coming off the bye. I like both of these quarterbacks in your lineup. And that's going to wrap it up for all the Week 11 quarterback matchups. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully this helps you set your lineup at the quarterback position. The tight ends will be out today also. Running backs, wide receivers were posted yesterday. Thank you all for stopping by. If you enjoyed, smash that like button, subscribe. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.